of thought within limits. Spinoza's thoughts often went beyond these limits, but he stoutly maintained his right to have such thoughts, if not to publish them. And just as in threatened 17th-century Holland, the government's prime duty should be to ensure as best it could the security of its citizens. Spinoza's political thinking was far ahead of its time. To us it may appear somewhat naive in places. In its own time, such near-utopianism was regarded as dangerous rubbish, or little short of ridiculous. Yet the attitude that Spinoza adopted towards the state is very much in line with present-day thinking in the liberal democracies of the westernized world. A person has a right to hold racist, sexist, or even offensive politically correct views, but is restrained from putting these into action. Rousing the mob to violence against private smokers is against the law. When the Tractatus was finally published in 1670, it hardly helped Spinoza's cause. Suffice to quote one typical reviewer who declared that the book was forged in hell by a renegade Jew and the devil, and issued with the knowledge of Mr. Jan de Witt. Jan de Witt was the Dutch statesman and opponent of the Royalists, whose political skills had helped protect Holland from the aggressive attentions of both England and France, a pet scapegoat among reactionaries for all the ills of the age. These were troubled times for Holland, and even Spinoza was not immune to events around him, as we can see from his political theories in the Tractatus. These contained a blend of quietism and impracticality, which nevertheless ensured that the Tractatus was banned 4 years after its publication. In 1665, the Dutch had become involved in a war against England. In this, the Dutch did better than anyone since William the Conqueror, including Napoleon and Hitler. At one point, they sailed up the Thames and the Medway, burned the English fleet, destroyed the naval yards, and seized the port of Sheerness. Dutch guns were audible even in London, where they caused a panic and prompted the diarist Samuel Pepys to make his will. A peace had been patched up with the help of Louis XIV, but in 1672 the French laid claim to the Spanish Netherlands, now Belgium, and invaded Holland. In the ensuing alarm and political turmoil, de Witt was set upon by the mob in the Hague and torn limb from limb. When Spinoza heard of this incident, he became incandescent with rage. He immediately went to his room and made a placard on which he wrote, "The very lowest of barbarians." This was his description of the mob which had murdered de Witt. Spinoza intended to march through the streets and publicly hang his placard on the wall at the very spot where de Witt's murder had taken place. This act of suicidal foolhardiness was fortunately prevented when his landlord discovered what he was up to and locked him in his room. By this time, Spinoza was living within the city limits of The Hague. His first residence in the city centre had been a room at 32 Stille Verkade, which in those days had been on the quayside of a canal that is now filled in. Some 25 years later, Spinoza's early biographer, the pastor Celerus, was to live in this very room while writing his invaluable work. But this room had proved too expensive for Spinoza, though not his biographer, as is often the case with the biographers of genius, and Spinoza had moved to another room on Pavilionsgracht, in a house owned by the painter Van der Spieck. This house is now maintained as a Spinoza museum, and it's possible to see the panelled room with its old beamed ceiling and small mirror beside the window where Spinoza lived during the last decade of his life. According to Celerus, who gathered material for his biography from people who remembered Spinoza when he was alive, the philosopher was always meticulously dressed, despite his poverty. Yet according to another source, as for his clothes he was very careless of them, and they were no better than those of the meanest citizen. Tramp or dandy? Judging from his portraits, Spinoza probably dressed indifferently, at the frayed cuffs level of gentility. Spinoza went on grinding his lenses and writing. He began a Hebrew grammar which he was never to finish, but he did succeed in completing a treatise on the rainbow, a subject which seems to have held a curious fascination for the great philosophers of the period. Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz all wrote on the rainbow, and though this was not a traditional philosophical subject, and there was thus no need for them to maintain the philosophic tradition of getting it wrong, all of them managed to do so. By now Spinoza's works were being circulated privately, and a group met regularly in The Hague to discuss his ideas. Among this group was a wealthy medical student called De Vries. When de Vries learned that Spinoza was ill and likely soon to die, he decided to leave Spinoza a gift of 2,000 florins and an annuity of 500 florins. But Spinoza refused to accept this gift and insisted that the annuity be reduced to 300 florins. He appears to have become rather paranoid about compromising his intellectual independence, and went on eking out a living grinding his lenses. By now he had become a respected thinker throughout Europe. His accolades from the religious authorities alone spoke for themselves, and several celebrated intellectual figures came to visit him in his dusty, spider-webbed room. The most interesting of these was Ernfried Walter van Tschirnhaus, the German scientist, who together with his alchemist assistant discovered how to make hard porcelain, which went into production at Meissen in the early 18th century, just too late to make him a fortune. He died in 1708. Another visitor was Leibniz, at the time the only other philosophic mind on a par with Spinoza in continental Europe. Spinoza discussed his ideas with Leibniz, and even showed him a copy of the Ethics as well as other unpublished papers. Leibniz was so impressed by this unpublished material that as soon as he returned home to Germany he began plagiarizing it. In 1673, Spinoza was offered the chair of philosophy at the University of Heidelberg by the local ruler, Count Palatine Karl Ludwig. The post was offered on condition that the philosophy Spinoza taught would not contravene the teachings of the Church, which shows how much Count Karl had read of Spinoza's philosophy. Spinoza had the sense to turn down this prestigious post. Spinoza continued to correspond with a wide range of eminent intellectuals. These included his old friend Heinrich Oldenburg, whom he had first met at Regensburg. Several years earlier, Oldenburg had been appointed first secretary of the Royal Society in London. No one had seemed to object to this Dutch citizen continuing in his post throughout England's war against Holland, nor did anyone appear to find it odd that he continued to correspond with his Dutch friend Spinoza in Holland. The war delayed the mail a bit, but didn't otherwise interfere with regular communication between the two pen pals. Surprisingly, this exchange of abstruse ideas, which would have appeared to any censor worth his salt as an obvious code, led to no suspicion that either was a spy. You had to do far more, or less, in those days to attract such attention, as Spinoza was soon to discover. In May 1673, Spinoza received an invitation from the French statesman Condé to visit him in Utrecht and discuss his ideas. Utrecht was only 30 miles away, but at the time it was under French occupation. Spinoza was given papers granting him safe conduct, and set off to meet this brilliant man, who was a friend of Molière and Racine. When Spinoza arrived in Utrecht, he discovered that Condé had been called away on state business. After hanging around for a few weeks, doubtless baffling the French chefs with his demands for milksops and raisin gruel, Spinoza finally returned to The Hague, where rumours quickly began to spread that he was a French spy. Things soon took a dangerous turn. It was only a year since the De Witt lynching. Spinoza decided that the answer to these rumours was quite simple. He would go into the street and announce to the mob that he was certainly not a spy. Fortunately, his long-suffering landlord once again managed to lock him up in the nick of time, and eventually the affair blew over. To this day there remains an element of mystery surrounding this episode. It has been seriously suggested that Spinoza was sent to conduct secret political negotiations with Condé on behalf of the Dutch government. But under the fraught and delicate political circumstances of the time, this is unthinkable. What is just possible is that Spinoza was so unlikely an emissary that he was ordered to undertake the journey and entrusted with some kind of secret message. Spinoza was now in his early 40s. The long, hard nights of lonely thought and eking out a day-to-day living on the cash he earned from lens grinding were beginning to take their toll on his weak constitution. It seems likely that his lungs were affected by constantly inhaling ground glass. He began to suffer from phthisis, a wasting disease associated with tuberculosis. By the summer of 1676, Spinoza's frail, consumptive figure was seen less and less about the quarter, and when winter set in, he took to his bed. His health began to fade rapidly. Spinoza died on Sunday, February 21st, 1677, while his landlord was at church. At the time, Spinoza was being attended by his long-time friend, Dr. Meyer. There's a curious story that after Spinoza died, Dr. Mayer disappeared with loose change on Spinoza's table and a silver-handled knife. This seems preposterous, though it may just be possible, and just as possible that the kleptomaniac doctor also managed to filch Spinoza's entire stock of several hundred unfinished lenses, which later fell into the hands of the canny antique dealer Cornelius van Halluyn. Either way, most people had the impression that there wasn't much left when Spinoza died. Even his greedy half-sister Rebecca decided that this time there was nothing worth going to court over. But these reports conflict with other evidence, which states that Spinoza left a library of 160 books, the catalogue of which has been preserved. Such a collection would have fetched a tidy sum in those days, when leather-bound books were used even for reading as well as decor. Spinoza also left a number of unpublished works, including the masterpiece for which he will always be remembered, the Ethics. These works and his letters were published as his opera posthuma, posthumous works, in the very year that he died. But they were published anonymously, as Spinoza specifically decreed that he wished there to be no doctrine named after him. According to the executor of his will, in the 11th definition of the passions, in Spinoza's Ethics, where he explains the nature of ambition, he plainly charges with vainglory those who do after this sort. In the following year, the authorities did their best to deny Spinoza's last wishes by attracting as much attention to his opera posthuma as they could. Spinoza's work was identified with its author and banned, on the grounds that it labefacted the faith and vilipended the authenticity of miracles. His entire work was declared profane, atheistic, and blasphemous. Spinozism was born, and just to help it on its way, a few years later the French encyclopedist Bayle defined Spinozism in his dictionnaire as the most monstrous hypothesis imaginable, the most absurd. A sadly illiberal view, coming from another who had found it expedient to live in tolerant Holland on account of his beliefs. This high-level criticism of Spinoza's work continued well into the next century, when no less than Hume described it as a hideous hypothesis. Oblivious to such criticism in death, as he probably was in life, Spinoza lies buried in Nieuwkerk, in Dam Square, in the centre of Amsterdam. Afterward. Spinoza made the mistake of viewing the world rationally, when of course it is nothing of the sort, either in fact or ultimately. Modern mathematical scientists fall into a similar error when they view it mathematically. Philosophers before Spinoza naively tended to view the world from the human viewpoint. Philosophers after him have persisted in this approach with increasing awareness of its limitations. Spinoza, on the other hand, dispensed with the human viewpoint, choosing to see the world sub specie eternitatis, beneath the gaze of eternity. Nowadays philosophers and scientists alike accept the futility of searching for any ultimate truth. Such truths as we can discover can only be ours, that is to say, from our point of view. Any ultimate objective yardstick is inconceivable and unspeakable. God is dead also means that eternity is blind. Spinoza pointed out that the pursuit of reason would disenchant the world. By this he meant that reason would strip it of its sacred as well as its superstitious aspects. He saw this as only a stage in our understanding of ourselves and the world. If we pursued rational thought to its next stage, we would rediscover God in a religion of disenchantment. This proved too much for the religious authorities of Spinoza's day, who suspected that most rationalists would remain at the first stage. Their suspicions have more than been confirmed. Most scientists today remain in Spinoza's novice stage of rational development, and even those who arrive at a religion of disenchantment remain beyond the pale of all religious orthodoxy, with the possible exception of Buddhism. But then so did Spinoza. Indeed, it is difficult to see precisely what Spinoza meant by this religion of disenchantment. A universal God, who can be properly apprehended only by the application of reason to the world around us? This suggests that Spinoza's religion of disenchantment could in fact be a prescient description of modern science, a pantheistic universe whose truth we can apprehend only by the use of reason, mathematics, and rational experiment, a God world where number is prayer. This may be what Spinoza had in mind, and indeed it may be a beautiful poetic description of modern science seen sub specie eternitatis. Unfortunately, it is not how most modern scientists regard the universe. The rationalism introduced